A struggling painter once set out to capture more than landscapes, using paint to express what he was
I
feeling.
tried to paint what I felt, not simply what I saw.
While his mind wrestled with doubt and
I
isolation,
would pass by a grave bearing my name and date of birth.
Vincent Van Gogh kept returning to the canvas, turning emotion into color.
It was no longer only emotion, it was something that took hold of me.
Almost no one noticed during his lifetime, until the quiet determination of his sister-in-law Jo
Without her steadiness, I suspect much would have been lost.
helped bring his work to the world. His colors would go on to change art forever. And for the first time, he's here to talk about it.
Mr. Van Gogh, welcome. Our audience has been waiting for this conversation for quite some time. I imagine it must feel unusual to know that so many years later, people are still eager to hear from you.
It is unusual, yes. And if I'm honest, it surprises me. There were so many brilliant individuals who influenced the world in tangible ways. Men who advanced science or reshaped nations. Perhaps they deserved such attention before I did. What I did was just painting.
You say that very simply, almost as if it were something small. I think, and I would say that our audience will agree with me, that you did much more than just painting, because in your case, it was never just technique. It carried something deeply personal. When you think about the fact that your work was barely recognized during your lifetime, does that still trouble you, or have you made peace with it?
I would be dishonest if I said it never troubled me. I wanted my work to be seen. I wanted it to be taken seriously and to be understood. There were times when the absence of response weighed heavily on me. I tried to paint what I felt, not simply what I saw. In that sense, perhaps I approached painting differently from many who came before me. But I do not imagine that I altered the course of the world. I did not improve it in any practical sense. I did not make it better, faster, or more advanced. I only gave it my colors. It was the smallest thing I could offer, but it was all I had.
And yet, there comes a moment in every artist's journey when the work is no longer entirely in their own hands. At a certain point, your paintings and letters came into the care of your sister-in-law, Johanna. Over time, she became instrumental in bringing your work to a wider audience. Do you believe your work would have endured without her determination?
I truly do not know. At that time, the paintings had little market value. Many were unsold. Some were stored without particular care. They were not widely sought after, nor carefully preserved. It is entirely possible that, without someone willing to protect them, they might have been dispersed, damaged, or simply forgotten. I did try to make my name known. I sent works to exhibitions. I wrote letters. I hoped they would find their way into the right hands. But I was never particularly skilled, or perhaps not particularly inclined, to promote myself. I believed the paintings should speak for themselves, and I did not always know how to communicate in the way the art world required. Jo understood that presentation was a key to access recognition. She took care not only of the canvases, but of the narrative around them. She brought them before the public gradually, with persistence, and she did not lose faith when the response was still uncertain. Without her steadiness, I suspect much would have been lost. She wanted the world to know who I was, and, according to her, how much my work mattered.
She truly did not let it go. Over time, your paintings not only gained recognition, but they also began to generate financial return for your family. When you think about that, about your work eventually providing support in very practical ways, how does that sit with you?
It is something I could never have anticipated. For much of my life, my work required sacrifice from those around me, particularly Theo. I depended on him more than I wished to. To learn that the paintings later offered support to the family, especially in caring for my sister Wilhelmine after her illness, carries a certain weight. She suffered greatly. Her mental condition required long-term care, and such care was neither simple nor cheap. If the paintings contributed, even indirectly, to her being looked after with dignity, then that gives me a kind of quiet relief. I did not manage to provide stability while I was alive. If the work later brought some measure of it, then perhaps it fulfilled a purpose I could not foresee.
Would you like to tell us more about your family? You grew up in quite a large household, didn't you?
Yes, fairly typical for that time. We were 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. My father, Theodorus, most people called him Doris, was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. He was known in the community, sometimes even nicknamed the Handsome Reverend, though he was not considered a particularly remarkable preacher. He was steady, respectable, devoted to duty. My mother, Anna, had a different temperament. She came from a cultured background and had received a proper education for a woman of her standing. She drew often: plants, flowers, small studies from nature. It was considered appropriate, even refined. She gave me my first drawing lessons, and I suspect it is because of her that I developed such a deep attachment to nature. Observing it closely became second nature to me.
And your 5 siblings? What became of them?
Well, in truth, there were 7 of us. Before I was born, my mother had a child who did not survive. His name was Vincent Van Gogh. He was born exactly 1 year before me, the same day, the same month. I was named after my grandfather, or perhaps after him. It was a quiet fact within the family, but one that stayed with me. As for my brothers, Theo was an art dealer, thoughtful and steady. He supported me in ways I could never fully repay. During my most difficult years, he stood by me without hesitation. Whatever I achieved in part because he believed I should continue.
It sounds like Theo was more than just a brother to you.
Yes, he was much more than that. My other brother, Cor, pursued engineering and later military service. His life took a very different path. My sisters, Anna, Elizabeth, and Wilhelmine, each followed their own course. Wilhelmine suffered greatly in later years. Her illness required long-term care, and that weighed heavily on the family. Elizabeth wrote a book about me later on. Her account was not entirely aligned with the image Joe was trying to protect. There were tensions around that. Anna and I lived rather separate lives after I moved away. Distance, once created, has a way of remaining. In many ways, we were an ordinary family, with ordinary problems like any other.
When you were old enough to truly understand it, how did you process the fact that there had been another child before you, one who carried your name?
It is not something a child fully understands at first. But as one grows older, the awareness settles in quietly. Every Sunday, I remember, on the way to my father's church, I would pass by a grave bearing my name and date of birth. Seeing it there, carved in stone, felt strange, unsettling.
I can imagine that must leave a deep impression on a child.
It did. It touched something deep inside me, though I could not fully name it as a child. As I grew older, I began to wonder whether I could ever truly be the first son my parents had once expected. There was always the quiet awareness that I came after a loss. At times, it made me feel as though I was living in a place that had once belonged to someone else, as though I had to prove that I deserved to be there. When I sensed disappointment, whether it was truly there or only in my own mind, those feelings grew stronger. I began to worry that I was not the son my parents had hoped for. And when I think about it now, I sometimes wonder whether my dedication to painting was also a way of building something that was entirely mine, something that could not be confused with anyone else's life.
Was that something openly discussed in your household, or was it simply understood in silence?
It was never truly discussed. There are some things families do not speak about directly. They live with them quietly. My parents were not unkind, but the loss had happened, and it remained part of the atmosphere of the home. It was there without being named. As a child, you sense these things, even if no one explains them to you. And when something is not spoken, you begin to fill the silence with your own thoughts.
Before we continue, a quick thought. If you're enjoying this conversation, you can actually help decide what comes next by subscribing to the channel. Through the comments and community posts, you can suggest future guests, vote on upcoming episodes, and share questions you'd like us to ask. Thank you for being part of this. Now, let's continue. And do you think that feeling of needing to be seen as yourself is why you chose to sign your painting simply Vincent, rather than using your full name?
Perhaps. Signing Vincent felt personal, direct. I wanted people to know that it came from me, not from a name shared with someone else, not from a family, not from a memory. In some quiet way, I think I wanted to show others, and perhaps even prove to myself, that I existed as my own person, not as a continuation of someone who came before me, but as a living person trying to create something honest. And yes, I hoped the paintings would be recognized. I wanted them to be taken seriously, because I took them seriously.
You mentioned earlier that you tried to make your work known, but that you were not particularly inclined to promote yourself. Would you be willing to tell us more about that?
That is not the easiest subject. But if we are speaking honestly, then it should not be avoided.
Only if you are comfortable. If there are things you prefer not to explore, that is entirely your choice.
No, it is fair. I think the audience and people who are really passionate about art and my story should really know as much details as I can give. So, in regard to your question, I would say that I have always been more comfortable with work than with presentation. As a child, I preferred walking alone in the fields rather than joining large groups. I was thoughtful, perhaps overly so. Conversation did not come easily to me, unless it was about something that truly mattered. When I was 7, I attended a village school, but my parents withdrew me after some time. They believed that being among working class children might lower the standard of behavior they expected from me. They wanted a certain upbringing for their children, one that matched their position and values. But I never learned how to make myself pleasing in order to gain advantage. I did not enjoy flattering others or speaking lightly about things I cared about deeply. When I spoke about my work, I did so with conviction, sometimes with more intensity than was comfortable for those listening. I believed the work should stand on its own. I did not always understand that the world often requires more than that.
You lived in a period where painting had a very distinct, elegant, and refined style. Your work, however, stood apart and was not widely appreciated. Looking back, do you ever wonder whether things might have been different if you had adjusted yourself, your behavior, your approach, to fit more easily into that world?
It is a difficult question. Of course, I wanted things to be different. I wanted to sell. I wanted to be accepted. There were moments when I wondered whether I should soften myself, speak more carefully, behave in a way that made others more comfortable. But that was never easy for me. I could not simply change who I was in order to move more comfortably through the art world. If I had tried to present a version of myself that was more agreeable but not true, I believe something in the work would have suffered. Painting for me depended on being fully engaged, even when that made things more difficult.
Before painting became your life, you tried several very different paths, working in art dealing, then turning toward religion and missionary work. When you look back at those years, were you searching for something, or trying to live up to what your parents hoped you might become?
In those years, I was not so much choosing a career as trying to understand where I belonged. My entry into the art world came partly through family. My uncle, also named Vincent, was an art dealer, and through him I began working for Gauguin and C. It seemed respectable. It made sense for someone in my position. At first, I thought it might suit me. I loved art. I could speak about it with feeling. But the business side of it unsettled me. There were moments when paintings were discussed as merchandise rather than as something living, and I really struggled with that. I was perhaps too serious, too absorbed in what I believed art should mean.
So even within the art world, you felt somewhat out of place?
Well, it was not the art itself, it was the mechanism of selling and discussing sales that really bothered me. I then decided to move toward religion. That also felt natural. My father had devoted his life to the church, and I respected that. In the bodinage, among the miners, I believed I had finally found something honest. I lived as they lived, gave away what little I had, tried to share their hardship. But even there, things did not last. I was considered unskilled as a speaker and unable to organize meetings, so that path closed too. It is difficult to describe what that feels like. I began to wonder whether the problem was not the profession, but myself. I started drawing during that period, and when I did, I finally felt like myself. I did not have to convince anyone or sell anything. I could just observe and work. It felt more like the only thing that did not reject me.
During that period, as one attempt followed another without stability, did you begin to withdraw more from the people around you?
Yes, I suppose I did. When things do not go well, you become more careful around others. You do not want to explain yourself again and again. You do not want to answer the same questions about what you are doing with your life. I still wrote to Theo, of course. He was the only one I was really in contact with. Those letters were important. But in daily life, I kept more to myself. It was easier that way. I spent more time alone, working or thinking. Not because I disliked people, but because I did not feel I was moving forward in the same way they were. It becomes tiring to feel behind.
And when you were spending more time alone, did painting begin to feel less like something you enjoyed and more like something you depended on?
In the beginning, I drew and painted because it seemed like the only thing that felt steady. I did not approach it with great confidence. I simply kept working at it. When I worked, the day had some order. I would wake up, go out, set up the canvas, and begin. There was something practical about it. I could see whether I had done something or not. When I was not working, my mind would wander too much. I would start questioning myself, my life, and overthink everything around me. Working and being busy reduced that. So yes, in time, it became something I relied on. Not because it was easy, but because it gave me something solid to hold on to, an escape from my own mind.
In roughly 10 years, you produced an extraordinary number of paintings and drawings. The pace was intense, especially toward the end. How did you manage to work like that?
Well, there were several reasons. I began painting seriously later than many others, and I felt I had to move quickly. I studied constantly. I repeated subjects. I wanted to improve without losing time. But, honestly, when I worked, my mind was steadier. When I did not work, my thoughts could become restless and dark. There were periods when my mood would shift suddenly. Days of energy followed by days when everything felt heavy and uncertain. Painting helped steady that. It gave direction to the energy when it was strong, and it gave structure when things felt unstable. I will not say that work cured anything. It did not. But it helped me remain functional. Without it, I believe the instability would have taken over much sooner.
While we are on the subject, in each episode we select the question people most want answered, and we put it directly to our guest. Today, Vincent, the audience asks, when you painted the Starry Night, what were you looking at, and what were you trying to capture?
I painted it while I was staying in Saint-Rémy, in the asylum where I had admitted myself. I can speak more about that place shortly, but at that time my world had become very small. A room, a garden, the sky beyond the walls. The view was inspired by what I could see from my window, though the painting itself is not an exact copy. I did not paint it while looking directly at the sky. It came later, from memory, and from what remained in my mind. At night, the sky did not feel still to me. It seemed to move, almost to pulse. The stars appeared larger than they do in reality, and the darkness was not flat, but alive.
Interesting.
Was it hallucination? I cannot say with certainty. My perception was not always stable then. There were moments when light felt sharper, when movement seemed exaggerated. But when I painted, I was not trying to record confusion. I was trying to give form to intensity. The sky felt restless, but it also felt vast. In that vastness, my own turmoil seemed smaller. I wanted to capture that tension between agitation and calm.
When did you first realize that what you were experiencing was not simply exhaustion, but something deeper and more frightening?
For a long time, I told myself it was only fatigue, or nerves, or the consequence of working too much and sleeping too little. I pushed through it. But there were moments where my thoughts would race beyond reason. I could feel energy in my body that I could not contain. I would speak too quickly, work without rest, and make plans that felt urgent and necessary. Then, without warning, the opposite would come, a heaviness, a silence inside me, doubt that was not intellectual but physical. The first time I truly felt fear was when I realized I could not control the shift between those states. It was no longer only emotion, it was something that took hold of me. And once you sense that your own mind can turn against you, even briefly, it changes how you experience everything.
How were you living during those periods?
I was working so intensely that everything else became secondary. There were days when I lived mostly on bread and coffee, and I smoked far too much. Later, especially in Arles, I drank more than I should have, sometimes absinthe, not so much out of pleasure, but to quiet my thoughts. I would work from early morning until there was no light left. And even then, I often could not rest properly. Sleep was irregular, and my mind did not slow easily. Money was limited, so comfort was never a priority. But the truth is that even if I had more, I doubt I would have lived differently. If I had to choose between buying food or buying paint, I often chose the paint.
With everything you've described, how are you actually surviving financially?
I have to thank my brother Theo. I largely depended on him. From the time I decided to take painting seriously, he supported me almost entirely. When I was in Paris, where he worked steadily as an art dealer, I lived with him for some time. Later, when I moved to Arles in the south of France, he continued sending money regularly. Without that support, I could not have continued. It was not an easy arrangement. I was aware that I was relying only on him, and that awareness was not comfortable. I wanted to succeed partly so that I would not remain a burden to him. Theo never made me feel ashamed, even when I believed I should have. He encouraged me, and he believed in the work, sometimes more consistently than I did. Many of the paintings people now speak about were made possible because he paid the rent and bought the paint. That is the simple truth. Without Theo, I believe I would have stopped painting much earlier.
It sounds like Theo believed in you, even when the rest of the world had not yet caught up. And when you left Paris and went to Arles in the south, what were you hoping would change?
Paris had been important for me. I learnt a great deal there. I met other artists, saw new techniques, and understood color differently. But the city was too overwhelming for me. It was restless, busy, and loud, and that pace did not suit me. I was easily overstimulated, and I did not always manage that well. I wanted light, simplicity, space. The south offered something different: stronger sun, open landscapes, fewer distractions. I believed the environment might calm me, and at the same time, allow me to work more clearly. Colors became more intense. I began working more directly, more boldly. But it was not only about that. I had an idea, perhaps too hopeful, of creating a small community of artists, a place where we could work together, support one another, and not compete constantly as in Paris. I rented the yellow house with that idea. I thought that if the environment changed, perhaps everything else would become clearer as well.
And did Arles bring the clarity you were hoping for?
At the beginning, yes. Out of the city, the light changed everything. The colors were more vibrant and felt almost unreal. I worked with more confidence there. The paintings became brighter, more direct. For a time, I felt energetic. But I was still alone and struggling, both mentally and physically. I hoped the yellow house might offer some hope of recovery, and I believed companionship would reduce the strain I had been carrying.
Around that time, you painted the sunflowers, correct? You even prepared Gauguin's room with them. What did those paintings mean to you?
Yes, that is correct. I prepared the room for Gauguin and painted the sunflowers to place there. In fact, I painted several of them. There was hope in those paintings. I imagined they could decorate the house, almost like a kind of welcome for anyone who came to work there. Yellow had become a color that felt full of life in the south. The light, the fields, the sun itself. I wanted the room to feel warm and alive when Gauguin arrived. When I first rented the yellow house, it was quite empty. I slowly began to prepare it, buying simple furniture, arranging the rooms, imagining how artists might live and work there together, exchanging ideas rather than competing as we often did in Paris. The sunflowers were, in a way, a gesture of friendship.
That's quite a beautiful thought. It sounds as though you had imagined a very different future for that house.
Yes, I did. When Gauguin finally arrived, I believed that my idea might truly begin to form. For the first time in a long while, I felt that I might not have to work entirely alone.
Had you known Gauguin before he came to Arles? Or was that the first real connection between you?
We had met before, in Paris. The artistic world there was not very large, and painters often crossed paths. My brother Theo knew him well, as he handled some of his work, so our paths naturally intersected. We spoke about painting, about color, about direction. Even then, it was clear that we approached art differently. I respected him. He had confidence, and he was certain about his ideas. In a way, I was not always certain about mine. When I moved to Arles, I began writing to Theo about the idea of building something in the south. Gauguin was already part of that thought. I believed that if we worked side by side, we could strengthen each other's work. I did not fully consider how difficult it can be when two strong temperaments share the same space.
What happened between the two of you?
At first, there was energy. We worked during the day and spoke about art in the evenings. Our discussions were serious and often passionate, and although we disagreed frequently, I believed that disagreement could sharpen ideas. Over time, however, those differences became heavier. Gauguin preferred order and control. He painted from memory and imagination, shaping the image carefully in his mind, while I worked more directly, responding to what I saw and felt in the moment. He thought I was too impulsive, and I thought he was too detached. Living together quickly intensified everything. There was little space to retreat, and small disagreements stopped remaining small. Words began to carry more weight than they should have. I was already unstable, sleeping poorly, working excessively, drinking more than was wise, and his presence did not calm that. In some ways, it made it sharper. At times I felt judged, even if that may not have been his intention. The tension did not explode suddenly. It built gradually, until one evening it finally broke.
What do you remember about that night?
It is difficult to separate memory from emotion. The tension had been growing for days. Conversations became arguments. Arguments became silence. I felt restless, unsettled, and unable to quiet my thoughts. There was a sense that everything I had hoped to build in Arles was slipping away. That evening, something shifted inside me. I remember agitation, pacing, words spoken too sharply, a feeling that the room itself was too small. Gauguin decided to leave the house. In that moment, it felt as though the entire idea of the yellow house was collapsing.
That must have been devastating.
Yes, it was. After that, my recollection becomes uncertain. There was confusion, a break in continuity. At some point, I injured myself and cut most of my ear off. I wrapped it and left the house. I walked to a nearby brothel and handed it to a woman there. I cannot explain the reasoning clearly, because there was none that would make sense now. The following day, the police found me back at the house, weak from the loss of blood and not fully aware of what had happened. When people speak of that night, they focus on the ear. For me, the more frightening part was the realization that I had lost control of myself. That was when I understood that this was no longer exhaustion or temperament. It was something deeper.
Some have suggested that you may have been experiencing some ringing or noise in your head that night, caused by the severe agitation, something overwhelming. Do you remember any physical sensation that pushed you toward that act, or was it purely emotional?
There was agitation, certainly. My mind had been racing for days. Lack of sleep, arguments, too much drink, all of it building without pause. As for a ringing, perhaps. I remember a kind of pressure, a noise that was not entirely outside of me. Whether it was truly in my ear or only in my head, I cannot say now with certainty. But there was something persistent, something that would not quiet. When a person is already strained, even a small physical sensation can feel unbearable. Everything becomes amplified. But it was not only a sound, it was a state, a loss of proportion, a feeling that events were closing in on me and that I could not steady myself.
After that night, you were taken to the hospital, and eventually you admitted yourself to Saint-Rémy. What was going through your mind during that period?
When I left the hospital in Arles, there was no real sense of resolution. I was aware that something had happened that I could not simply explain away. People looked at me differently. I looked at myself differently. I decided to admit myself to the asylum in Saint-Rémy, as I believed it was the necessary decision. I understood by then that I could not continue living without supervision. I feared another episode, perhaps worse than the first. At the asylum, there was a strange mix of restriction and relief. I was confined, yes, but I was also somewhat protected from myself. The attacks did not stop. They kept coming in waves. During them, I lost continuity. After them, there was exhaustion and shame. But between those periods, there was clarity. And in those intervals, I worked, simply because it was still the one thing that felt familiar when everything else felt unstable.
In the final weeks of your life, you were in Auvers-sur-Oise, still painting intensely. Then came the shooting. Would you like to describe what happened there?
In Auvers, I was working again. The fields were wide and unsettled, and I painted them repeatedly. There was movement in those landscapes that felt familiar to me. I still carried the fear of another episode. I did not trust my mind. Financial pressure weighed on me, especially knowing Theo had his own struggles. I did not want to remain dependent forever. On that day, I was in the fields when there was an encounter involving a young man carrying a revolver, and in the confusion, the weapon discharged. It was not something I had arranged or intended. It happened suddenly. I was struck in the chest, and although I understood the seriousness of the injury, I did not accuse anyone or create a scene.
And you were able to walk back to the inn on your own?
Yes, I walked back on my own, slowly, aware that the situation was grave. As I lay there afterward, I began to understand that the wound would likely end my life. I was tired, not only in body, but in spirit. The illness, the instability, the constant effort to keep myself steady had been with me for years, and it had required more strength than I often had. In those final hours, there was a quiet I had not felt in a long time. It was not relief in a triumphant sense, but it was the absence of struggle. When Theo arrived, we spoke softly. There was no dramatic confession, no grand gesture, only a shared understanding that I had reached the end of what I could endure.
It must have been very difficult for the both of you. And, if I can speak for the audience too, we are very sorry for how things turned out. Now, I'd like to ask you something about the world we live in today. Many people now turn to things like social media, videos, or constant streams of images on their phones when their minds feel restless or overwhelmed. Instead of sitting with their thoughts, they distract themselves for hours. You said earlier that painting helps steady your mind. If you had lived in our time, do you think you might have turned to those kinds of distractions to quiet your thoughts? Or would painting still have been the thing you relied on?
It is difficult to say with certainty. When the mind is unsettled, distraction can feel comforting for a moment, perhaps addictive at times. Looking at images, listening to voices, allowing time to pass without thinking too deeply. I understand why people might do that. But for me, the relief came from something different. Painting required attention. I had to observe the light, mix colors, decide where each brushstroke belonged. That kind of work brought my mind into the present moment. I imagine that if I had spent my days looking at endless images created by others, it might have left me feeling even more restless. Images arriving one after another, without pause, without silence between them. I suspect that would have unsettled me rather than calmed me. My thoughts were already easily stirred by color, by movement, by light. Too many impressions at once could become overwhelming. What helped me was not watching the world pass before my eyes, but standing in front of it and trying to understand it through my own work.
Before we close, we have a final tradition on this podcast, where in each episode, our guest leaves behind an invisible object, something they once used in life, carrying a piece of who they were forward in time. Vincent, what object would you leave for us today?
Something of mine to leave behind, eh? I think I'd leave a worn paintbrush. I was also thinking of leaving a letter to Theo, but no, that is too precious, and I cannot leave it behind. It has to be the paintbrush, not a new one, not one kept for display, one that has been used until the bristles have lost their shape. To me, it was never just a tool. It was the one thing that steadied my hand when my thoughts were not steady, when pressure built inside me, when agitation grew or doubt became heavy. The brush gave that tension somewhere to go. It did not cure anything. It did not silence everything, but it allowed me to continue. If I leave anything behind, let it be that. Not the finished canvas, but the instrument that helped me endure long enough to make it.
Vincent, thank you for being here with us today. I imagine that revisiting these moments, the doubt, the illness, the final days, cannot be easy. We are grateful that you chose to speak about them so openly. Beyond the paintings, we've had the chance to hear the human story behind it all. And that is something we do not take lightly. It has truly been an honor to have you with us.
Thank you. It is not always comfortable to look back at one's life, especially the parts marked by confusion and illness. But if speaking openly about it allows the work to be understood more clearly, then I believe it is worthwhile. Many people carry struggles that are not visible. They wake each day and continue quietly, even when the mind feels uncertain or heavy. If there is anything in my story that can offer them recognition, not admiration, but understanding, then that matters. I did not always find peace myself, but I did continue to work, to try, to return to the canvas even after failure. If there is hope, perhaps it lies there, not in perfection, but in persistence.
We remember Vincent Van Gogh for his paintings, but his story was not carried by talent alone. It was carried by people, by Theo's loyalty, by Joe's determination to preserve his work when no one else would. Sometimes the course of a life is changed not only by what we create, but by who stands beside us, who believes when we cannot, and who keeps our story alive. Behind every legacy, there is often someone who refused to let it disappear. And perhaps that is something worth remembering. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and never stop learning from the world around you. I'm your host, and this is Get to Know.
Thank you for watching.